Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of Creative Piecemeal Podcast. I am your host, Tammy Takeishi. Today I am joined by one of my former professors and a fellow music therapist, Dr. Claire Ghetti. She is an instructor at the University of Bergen in Norway. She's an associate professor, program coordinator, and integrated master's program in music therapy there, and the assistant leader at GAMUT, the Grieg Academy Music Therapy Research Center. Past and current research includes music therapy to reduce traumatization in intensive medical contexts, infant caregiver interaction in the setting of prematurity, music therapy as procedural support for invasive medical procedures, music therapy as emotional approach coping, music therapy for substance use problems, and music therapy theory. And she's had quite a few publications across various journals, which you guys can check out in the show notes if you want to nerd out over some music therapy, but very excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Tammy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get started with our barrage of questions, do you want to take a moment to talk about any of your current projects?
We are working on a large team, and myself, we're working on a large randomized controlled trial that goes over 2 years of the participant's life. So it's one of the rare, I guess, longitudinal types of RCTs that we have in our field of music therapy. So we're just at the point where we're analyzing data from the discharge time point when the premature infants are discharged from the hospital. And it's a resource-oriented approach where we're supporting parents as they discover how they can use their voices in a way that helps relate to their infant in a developmentally appropriate sort of way for the premature infant, that they can read each other's cues a little bit better and interact in a more satisfying way. So that's exciting for us that we're getting to the point of analyzing data. It's also been a long project now. We started in 2018, so we're excited to move forward.
That is always exciting, being able to get to that next step in research, and I'm looking forward to reading and seeing all of that when it comes out. So from the beginning, who or what inspired you to become a musician and music therapist?
I think there were seeds planted earlier in my life when I was in high school, for example. Occasions where I experienced personally how deeply music could take the place or fill the space in very significant life moments. So perhaps one of the most profound moments was when one of our peers, who was the drum major. I was in a marching band down south in Georgia, and down south, marching bands can be quite intense, at least ours was. It kind of was aspiring to be a small drum corps, drum and bugle corps in a way. So we had lots of practices together. We really bonded as a group, everyone that was in that band. And the drum major who we looked up to, who was an upperclassman and very cool and in his own way and inspiring, and the way that he led us. He was killed suddenly by someone who was running away from the police and crashed into his car. So at the funeral, we all wore our marching uniforms and we marched in to the recording of the music that we played on the field at our last show. And the thing that's different about our marching band is we were using classical music, like some of the drum corps do there when they compete, and we competed as well. So it was Saint-Saëns, the organ symphony, which is an extremely moving and forceful and powerful piece of music, using all of the pulls and the stops of the organ and all of the capacity of the organ to express a deep range of emotions, I would say. musically. And so that piece is a very strong piece in itself. And then as we marched in, hearing the movement that was maybe the climax for us there, it was a way that we could pay witness to who he was and what he meant to us without having to use words. And I think in that experience of just the pride, I think in the solidarity that we all had, brought all of us together. I can't remember if we had 60 or 80 or however many were in the ensemble, but it was just a very unifying experience of solidarity and in the grief and paying witness in a way that we could through the music. So I think that living through that that connection and realizing how much the music takes place in our lives, where words I feel often can't go. That's my bias. I know that other people go much further with their words than perhaps I can fathom, but that the music can go in these places and hold pain and grief at that level, or hold such a range of emotions simultaneously, because of obviously everyone in that ensemble and the parents and the band director and so forth experienced it differently, but we were probably all being impacted by hearing that music and what that meant. So I think I took that forward with me in wanting to do something with music. And I started off in my undergraduate degree in flute performance and double major in French as language studies. And pretty quickly I realized I am not one who has the attention span to practice 4 or 5 hours a day, every day, here on out, that I wanted to be closer to interacting with people through music and not necessarily doing that from a stage. So that was not filling the need that I felt with music in a way that I thought was, matching what I felt was most meaningful in use of music. And as far as the French, I realized that when you start learning a foreign language late in high school, that maybe that it felt like it was too late at that point to learn, to master a language. So I thought I need to switch to something that I can do, that is a natural extension of what's quite important to me. And I think at that point I happened to read a book. Ironically, to me, it was Don Campbell's Music and Miracles. Which I have recollection of it having stories that were just very far-fetched about what the powers of music could do. But it was also something that in a way inspired me to think, okay, people are obviously working with music in a different way than conveying it and performing it and interpreting it as one does as a musician, performing musician, that they're also thinking of these other ways, tying back to shamanic traditions and other traditions of how music in indigenous cultures has been used in healing practices. So that was quite interesting to me, and I searched a little bit more. Back then we didn't have the internet, we didn't have Google that was so easy to search for things, so it took a little bit longer to find out that there was a profession of music therapy. So then that was quite interesting and inspiring for me to find out that you could put things together like psychology and health practices and music, and getting deeper into understanding music on a variety of instruments and a variety of genres of music, and working with people, and that all sort of came together for me. So I pursued that as my an equivalency in master's after the bachelor's.
Thank you for sharing that, very powerful story. Everyone always has a different, I guess you could say, origin story for how they come to their profession. And it sounds very special that you had a chance to really feel the power of music and let it work its magic, so to speak, and inspire you to search out music therapy.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why I also gravitated towards working with people in very difficult life situations, whether that was actually at the end of life, working with children and infants and teenagers in the pediatric intensive care unit who were maybe nearing the end of their lives or had a sudden accident, and that was going to be the result, or working with their families there in that setting. But also people with substance use problems, and thinking about how music there is a bridge to so many things. It can be related to the actual use itself and that lifestyle, but it can also be a source for empowering oneself and into a new situation and into a new way of being. Yeah, so I think some of those profound transformations in a way in one's life was something that I was interested in with music therapy.
And you're definitely able to see that in your work and in your research. And do you notice that in your teaching as well? I mean, have you been able to make those connections there?
I think so. It's interesting trying to figure out the balance of how personal do you go into this, or how deeply do you go? Because when you're teaching, you don't know the life history of each student who's there. I try to tie in the music. I try to tie in examples from practice that I've obviously protected in a way by changing some things so that no one can identify the situations that I'm discovering, but trying to make it real for my students. But, if I start a lecture, for example, on the project Long Step that we're doing right now for music therapy for premature infants and their caregivers, that I try to start with a lullaby and just sing that out in class. And I realized that I sing that lullaby and it means a certain thing to me, but it could mean very different things to other people sitting in that room. And what is it doing to them? We can address that and acknowledge that as you go through the teaching, but you can't necessarily know what it means for everyone there and what they do afterwards unless they share it. And there are cases, of course, where someone doesn't feel comfortable sharing that in front of the group or even privately with me afterwards. And so it's trying to find that balance of how much do you try to bring the students into the experiences when you're talking about working with people at the end of life or in traumatic situations, bringing them into that without necessarily setting things off for them as well.
I remember when you were teaching at Montclair, there were experiential things built into the class and built into what we did. And I really loved the process. I mean, speaking for me personally, I really loved the process of being able to have that in a safe environment, because I feel like it made us better music therapists and able to be more prepared, not only with our own emotions, but also having examples, like you said, pulled in from outside. So again, speaking from my experience, but I can imagine being a professor, like you're walking a fine line from inspiring and motivating and showing students something and the power of music, but also, protecting them in that environment.
Yeah. And my colleagues and I are noting now in this time of the COVID pandemic, that our students who obviously come from rich life experiences and some difficult life experiences and have their own issues that they're working on in their private life and with their health that we don't know about in particular, that this is an even more trying time now. And you can just sense that threshold for doing too much and not being able to take care for what you open up is it's even lower, shall we say. It's even easier. So I think there's a lot of vulnerability right now for all of us in the world undergoing this pandemic, because it's shaken us in different ways over time, and it's created instability and uncertainty and long-term stress and change in our patterns of engaging in the things that we cope, or the ways that we cope by the activities, such as all the choir singers and people that do things socially that help them cope, that now they have to not do, or have to do in a very modified way. So I'm quite aware that it's a more tenuous relationship now in the teaching and taking care of the students, or making sure that we're aware of what their needs are. At the same time, I feel like it's a great learning experience for all of us, because it's sort of like when you go in the role of a client yourself as a music therapist, that it's an invaluable experience to go through therapy and know firsthand what it's like to be vulnerable and to put yourself out there, and issues of power, the relation with the therapist, and all of these different aspects. I think it's important that we have those experiences as people who want to be helpful to others, have a helpful therapeutic relation with other people, that we have taken both sides there to do that well. And so I think the pandemic, in a way, puts all of us in that vulnerable space where we're all experiencing different types of losses, or compromised life experiences, or fears or uncertainties, that's impacting us. And of course, it's impacting people in different ways. And some people are being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic as well. It's a learning experience, and I try to encourage my students to think of it as such, especially at the beginning, like to turn it around and think about, okay, music is still probably extremely important to each of us, the teaching staff and the students, and now think about how you can use your music as your own way to cope with this stress and uncertainty, and see if you can keep going back to that to enrich your experience right now when so many other things are cut off.
I'm so proud to be part of such an inspiring and beautiful field in the therapeutic world, and that mixes arts and psychology. And I feel like it's always important, but especially now, I feel like arts and the mental health fields have really been highlighted, elevated, and sort of needed more than maybe in prior times, and given a little more thought to them. And I'm wondering, have you noticed anything surprising positively during the pandemic in regard to music therapy? Like, do you feel that more students are, enrolling in programs, or do you feel that more people are reaching out to get help, or discovering music and playlists for themselves, things like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in general, I live in Norway now, and I think in general, the population here, like the public, understands why music would be helpful in someone's life on a more profound level. I sort of feel like in the United States, it's understood as a commodity and something that you stream. Hopefully you buy it as well. And there's like the glamour of the artists and so forth. And certainly that occurs here as well. But I tell people that I'm a music therapist, or I teach music therapy, and they're not thrown off. Like in the United States, it was always like, what? You're a what? And you get paid for that? Like, oh, that's novel. Sort of a joke or some sort of demeaning mark. And here, I tell people, and they say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or I know a music therapist, or oh yeah, okay. They take it as, I mean, maybe they're just not saying it out loud, but it seems like they're taking it seriously, and they're understanding what the potential could be. It's not surprising then when the Central University here in Bergen wanted to do some sort of supportive approach for students early on in the pandemic. And so they contacted the heads of some different departments and research centers and asked for some tips on creating some modules. So how could they use, I think exercise was one. So they talked to some exercise physiology professors and so forth, and found out what can you do with fitness and right now in your own home, or some tips for that. And others with behavioral health, like getting good sleep patterns and regular patterns of activity and whatnot. And then nutrition, I think, was one. And one was music therapy. In the US, that might be something that we would like to have that recognition, or like to be having someone reach out and ask an opinion like that, or as if we had some expertise to share. So I think that was quite nice in a small way to say, like, music could be just as important as exercise or nutrition or sleep in these times. And of course, it's a hard question to answer in that moment, because you say, well, this is music and it's maybe not music therapy, or that do we get into details? No, we don't get into details. We just support that people are realizing that music is helpful, and that we're trying to make that knowledge accessible to everyone who needs it and wants to use it. So I think in that way, maybe pandemic has led to some questions like that on a larger level of like, how can we use this? But at the same time, I notice this from the students, and I'm pretty sure it's happening for the staff too. People are so low on their own resources this year that we're not automatically reaching out and starting new programs and volunteering here and there, because each person is trying to make it through their everyday strain. So it is, again, that, like I was saying before, the situation where we're all kind of in this. And I think of, I know you did your internship with Joanne Lowy, and the book that she and her colleagues put out of caring for the caregiver after 9/11. That was very important. I was actually part of the 9/11 relief project in New York with Andrea Fishhara, was someone who's giving us supervision at that time. But that was very clear at that time that you have to obviously take care of the person who's giving care to someone else, or else the whole thing falls apart. So I think that's the case right now, that we have to find ways that care is given or experienced by all those who are reaching out, or that we expect to reach out, or else they can't function in that sort of way. And figuring out how that's done is a little bit difficult too.
I can understand. It's regardless of whether someone's in a creative field in their job or working from home, there's this new balance that we all have to sort of navigate and figure it out, and almost like being on a ship in a storm. But I feel like it's definitely progressed. I feel like, even looking on social media, people are sharing music performances or sharing like poetry readings, and it seems like arts have really risen to meet the occasion to help people through whatever they're going through during this difficult time.
Yeah, especially with the aspects of social isolation, although that's an oxymoron, the isolation from social interaction. I think the music is creating such an opportunity for people to be together. And it's interesting to see how we can do that asynchronously. For example, there are ways that choirs can come together, digital choirs that people play using certain types of software to put bands together, and in other ways. But it does seem like more people, when they couldn't come out of their apartments and couldn't engage in a lot of their houses, engage in a lot of the activities that they typically do, they could still be united or have hope or feel like they're part of something bigger through music that was important to them or to their communities. So I think definitely there is probably a greater awareness and maybe exploration right now of music as a resource for us in times of difficulty.
Definitely. And even people picking up instruments again, or picking up a paintbrush again, that they hadn't in a long time.
Yeah, right. And at the same time, I do think of all the people who have a much harder life now at this time. I mean, I think some people have maybe been able to connect with creative outlets, and others are just on the brink of trying to make every day go forward with their families and at home and so forth. So I think too, there's probably a lot of, I think those who are in a position of privilege in general are probably able to experience even more privilege in comparison to those who are generally not in that position of privilege, who are having to, like in New York, ride the subways and go in this whole time to their jobs because they're the frontline workers. And so, yeah, I think it's important too that we kind of temper our thoughts about what people are able to engage in right now, because I think there's quite a lot of disparity still.
Oh, definitely. Even among one's family. Like, for example, I work in the school districts, but one of my sisters is a frontline worker in the medical field. And we have two very different experiences about what we're doing when we're working and what we're doing when we're not working. Like, I've been able to start a podcast And my sister's just very busy all the time. And it is what it is, when we're both musicians, but she's in a frontline position and not necessarily able to access maybe some of the musical resources that she's been able to utilize in the past. Whereas I feel like you said privileged to have been able to access and even grow in coping during this time with creative arts. But along those lines, like obviously you're a musician and do creative arts. Is there anything that you would want to try if you had the time and the resources, any other creative art field that you're interested in?
Yeah, earlier in my career, I worked at an adult day healthcare program for adults with HIV and AIDS in New York. And there we had all of the creative arts therapies. So it was a great way to start my career in an interdisciplinary manner. And we had drama therapists and dance movement therapists. And I think I've always thought if I had to switch to another creative arts therapy, I think it would be dance and movement, actually, because I feel like there's so much that's expressed, again, non-verbally. Sometimes it's not so much in what we would consider music, but through sound or through sound expression. I think of the young people I've worked with, or when I've supervised students out in the field who are nonverbal, don't have language, but can communicate so much, so very clearly by some sort of a sound, and then an intense look in the face, or the whole body is moving and expressing something. And I think it's such a pure way of expression that I almost feel like if adults could do that in the work situation or in relationships, it might be helpful, because then people could actually express what they're feeling instead of sort of filtering it through words or filtering it through something that's socially more acceptable. So I'm kind of curious about how does that play out when you use that so openly as a creative medium? And also just the experience of music. I think we have that socialized out of us that we're not supposed to move too much when we listen, at least in Western cultures and with certain types of music. Please don't sway too much, that might bother other people in the audience. Or when you're an instrumentalist in an orchestra, you can move and express yourself, but you can't do too much. You can't stand up and stomp your feet when you feel like you really want to emphasize something. You can't move freely around the stage. It's like we have a very socialized way of experiencing music, both as performers, but also experiencing it as the audience. So I'd be curious if we could go back to our younger selves as kids, when we didn't know that there were social rules around that, and we would move and sing, or make songs up, or make sounds, and our body was integrated in a I think very authentic way that we've sort of parceled out as adults. And I don't know if that goes back to I was in Dalcroze Eurythmics when I was a kid, I guess. So I kind of learned originally about rhythm through movement first. And I think that maybe helped me later in life when I was in drumline, originally in marching band, that it was just sort of laying a little bit more in the body. But now when I play flute, I really like to stand and stamp my foot and whatever. I'm going to express it how I want to. But no one's listening to me. I don't know if I would do that on a stage, but it's sort of like, it's more integrated. So I think that would be interesting for me because I do feel like I'm sort of stuck in this box of what I've kind of been trained indirectly or directly to do or not to do with music, that would be quite freeing to combine all those things.
That sounds really fascinating too. I know I've looked into Dalcroze Rhythmics a little bit in the past, and just the idea of movement and choreographed with music, it sounds so fascinating, and seems like it would work really, really well with our field.
Yeah, maybe in some of the music therapy programs that are housed with music education, there's of course, as you probably know, the Kodai and Dalcroze are different ways of learning music and music education, but I wonder if there's more awareness. I know, for example, there's Orff varieties of music therapy that are inspired by the Orff Schulwerk method. So that'd be interesting to see if actually then music therapists are using Dalcroze.
What would you say has been some of the best advice that you've gotten regarding being a music therapist? And is that something that you feel you could pass that advice along to students?
Yeah, I think in my internship, that was in Minneapolis, and we worked in a skilled nursing facility. I think it was technically that had many different units. So there were some units for people with dementia, advanced stages of dementia, also people with traumatic brain injury and acute issues where they had two involved medical and nursing needs to be at a step down type of unit, but not so intense to be in the hospital. So they're kind of in between. And I remember on that unit where people were at the end stage of Alzheimer's, of course, we would have groups with some people who could come, and it was very difficult to get responses and to have connection. And I remember one of the other supervisors that was there, Molly Richter, I think was her last name. She said, just try to make it meaningful. And I think we all just latched onto this, like, of course, yeah. That, I mean, in my mind, it doesn't have to be effective. Here I am as a researcher looking at effects right now. It doesn't have to be effective. It doesn't have to be efficient. It doesn't have to be practical, but it has to be meaningful. And that means meaningful to the person who's engaged in it. We don't always know if it's meaningful or not, but I mean, I think that's what we're aiming for, is that this experience that we share in the music, let's try to make it meaningful in that moment at least, and maybe have a longer meaning to that person. So I sort of joke with my students too about the same idea now. It's like, don't get too caught up about what is the right thing, or all of these pressures that one might feel in a clinical environment, of just sort of coming back to that essential, is this meaningful right now? And if it's meaningful for that person, then you've done what you should do, I guess.
That makes a lot of sense. And, definitely something, like you said, that we need to come back to and remember in not only in our work, but I think in our daily lives, is what we're doing meaningful and purposeful? And, is it making the positive change that we're looking for?
Yeah. And right now I'm quite interested in the resource-oriented perspectives, as my colleague here, Randy Rosfjord, describes, that who is it meaningful to, and who decides what is meaningful. And I think in my training in the United States, emphasis was too much on what the therapist decides is meaningful in consultation with the interdisciplinary team. That was sort of, yes, that's important. And of course, the client gave input and talked about their own goals and so forth, but it was sort of understood that the one driving was still the expert music therapist as part of the team, and what was seen to be good for that person overall. And I think here it's turning that around and saying, you can't possibly know as the therapist what is good for that person. It needs to generate from the person who's seeking music therapy, and build from that upward, instead of sort of be placed downward on the person. And of course, the professors I had at University of Kansas would said the same thing. It's like, you can't assume, I know you're trained in neurologic music therapy, but that's an example I bring up to my students of someone who's had a stroke, for example, and has lost the ability to walk at the current moment. And one could continue to work on that very much to try to build independence for walking and moving along. Or maybe one could spend a lot of time helping that person connect with their children who now don't recognize the parent anymore, or have trouble understanding speech and so forth. And the goals need to be out of what is most meaningful for the client. And I think if the client says, I want to prioritize right now time with my family and having a meaningful connection, and I don't want to work on gait training, or I don't want to work on speech therapy either. I want to just express myself through music and with my family. And I think that needs to be respected and taken as the core there. So it's interesting to think about, to what degree do we really know what the clients or the people that seek music therapy want in music therapy. And in a lot of cases, it's not possible to have them talk about that. So I know, I'm sure in your clinical work too, a lot of people I've worked with cannot communicate verbally, or that's declined and they've lost that. So you can maybe talk to their caregivers or their family members, but sometimes they can't recognize either. So it's like, how do we know how we're being perceived in that moment? And what ways can we try to get some clues about what's happening there, and is it meaningful or not meaningful?
Agreed. Because ultimately it's what's going to best benefit the person coming to therapy. And, it's their goals and it's their right to, I guess, get in the driver's seat, so to speak. And it's almost like we're the passengers, maybe helping navigate a little bit with the GPS.
Yeah, that's really nice. And that's actually what we've purposefully tried to cultivate in Long Step in the study that we're doing right now, is knowing that in the neonatal intensive care unit, parents can often feel like they don't have the expertise, they don't have the know-how to help their child, that it's the doctors and nurses that do, and they're in the parents then become in the back seat, and the doctors and nurses and staff there is driving the car. And so when we come in for music therapy, we very much want to say, okay, parents are driving, music therapist is either in the passenger seat, or if there's not room, is in the back seat, and is just encouraging them along, and maybe a little word in the ear, something like, oh, in front of you, you'll notice there's a stop sign. What might you do when you see that stop sign? To try to help them interpret the signs and signals that are coming from their premature infant, that are most of the time, very clear. They're telling us they want more, or no, they're stopping, it's too much. And often the parents can be quite good at reading those signals and adjusting what they're doing musically, or how they're using their voice, or the amount of stimulation they're providing. Once they can see that, once they can sort of, that's what that means. The hand up is not, oh, I love you so much, I'm giving you a high five. It's like a stress sign, the halt hand. That's enough for right now. But if one doesn't necessarily know that, then they might interpret that as like, oh, my baby's reaching out for me. She wants to touch my hand and hold hands. And so I think that's great that you brought that into the car metaphor, because it's sort of like, who is actually driving. And we intend, of course, as music therapists, to empower our clients, but you could argue that you can't empower other people, like they have to be empowered themselves. So we need to make space for them, and therefore, in my opinion, we need to move out of the driver's seat and perhaps out of the front of the car as well.
So we're going to just take a left turn, no pun intended, and I was just wondering, how has your life in the creative arts been different than you imagined? I mean, did you ever think you'd end up moving to another country?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. First of all, no. Well, maybe. I didn't think it was going to be feasible. I would have definitely been open to it. Quite glad that it was feasible and we did move. I guess I didn't set off. I'm not one who sets off with certain goals, like I'm going to get married and have kids and live here and blah, blah, blah. Same thing with music therapy. I just wanted to see where it would take me. I think I had certain areas of practice I wanted to practice in, and medical settings was one of those, definitely. But then within that, I just wanted to explore and see what it was about. But I think after I had practiced for a while there, I realized that I have a certain way of looking at things and certain work ethic and attention that I felt like, okay, I need to maybe be using this in a way to maybe contribute to research, or in a more systematic way. So I sort of did feel at one point like, okay, I can continue being a music therapist and have sort of a limited impact, or maybe I can use the skill set of being willing to read a bunch of research articles and write things and write grants and conduct those research articles, and being willing to do all that sort of stuff. And maybe I should try to do that in a way that I think is meaningful for the field. I guess I didn't anticipate that, but certainly moving to another culture has been interesting in my development of understanding music therapy, because here there is a different, maybe there's more cohesiveness in the approach, that it is very firmly based in a humanistic understanding, and and very much looking at resources and looking at ways that one can think of music in not just an individual sort of context, but thinking about music for community and building community and in relation with others outside of just that which happens in a therapy room or in a session. So with community music therapy, of thinking about how can the value of music expand and one's connection to others in music be expanded to creating health, essentially, between people on a broader level, and one in a level that's sustained over time. So that's been quite exciting for me. I'm always stimulated by going into environments that are unknown and sometimes contrasting to my own thinking. I'm not too interested in collaborating with people that think too much like me, because then I feel like no one grows. You have to have some people that you maybe disagree with or don't quite understand, and you're trying to get to learn their perspective a little bit better. I find that quite stimulating. So I did want to sort of move out of familiar territory and come to a context that was new and discover that as well. And I think I got very lucky, because I just feel like some of the values in this society here, as far as social welfare, and as I was mentioning before, the valuing of music or other forms of expression, I think is inherent a little bit more cohesively in the culture here.
And of course, living in Norway, one of the happiest countries in the world, were there any surprising things that you discovered moving there, like stereotypes that maybe others had of you being from America, or you had stereotypes of living in Norway?
The most surprising thing at the beginning was realizing that there are actually two written languages, not just one. Norwegian means two different things. So that's the sort of thing that as you get into, like, so it's not just the challenge of learning one language, it's actually two written forms and endless dialects that align a little bit with one or the other of the written forms. But then again, that's actually fascinating to understand some of the social and political reasons for the two languages and the historical significance. So I think there was the challenge of language. I think I feel like, and I've written this too in a relatively recent editorial, saying that I didn't experience culture shock moving to Norway. And I don't feel like I've had culture shock at any point since I've been here, but I've definitely experienced it when I go back to the United States, of just sort of be like, what is going on here? So I don't know how closely, I guess, I align to an allegiance as an American. I think I spent a couple of years when I was a kid, some of my formative first years in Saudi Arabia. And there, a lot of my friends came from different countries and had different colors of skin and different backgrounds and stuff. And that was quite normal. And I think then when I moved to the United States, then I started to feel like an outsider, where I didn't know the Pledge of Allegiance, and it was difficult to become known with other people. And there was a lot more uniformity in the peer group that I was involved in, that was unfamiliar to me as well. And everyone had sort of not everyone, but people had more of an insular background, that they hadn't lived in another country or hadn't experienced people from certain areas of the world as their good friends or neighbors or whatnot. And I think that felt a little strange to me. So again, I don't know if it's for the social and political reasons that I feel more at home over here. Some of the sentiments, for example, related to race relations and whatnot here, they don't have the same history. Certainly there is still racism in Norway, but it's a whole different sort of historical context that one goes into versus the United States too. That it's been an eye opener to move out of the US, where I feel like one is indoctrinated in schooling to go along with the whole idea that the United States is superior and the democracy is the best form of government, and we have the best democracy, and we need to put that on all other nations in the world and bring that, free people with our democracy and so forth. And there's a lot that goes on of privileging and assuming the superiority of people in the United States that is kind of funny when you leave it and you look back at it and like, wow, there's a lot that's wounded and broken, and unequal, a lot of inequity going on, a lot of gender inequity, a lot of obviously racial issues with poverty that are quite profound in the United States, that there's a desire to sort of cover that up. So I think in coming to Norway, and probably that would have happened moving to a variety of other countries, when you come out of there and you look back at the United States, then I think it sort of reveals that to a different level, I guess. So that was probably a large digression here, but I think the shock to me, maybe, or the thing that was unexpected coming over here, was having that experience of then sort of seeing the United States as a bubble that I was outside of and looking back at. That has been kind of a surprise. And that brings up opportunities, obviously, for self-reflection and thinking about how does that relate to music therapy, for example, and what are the weaknesses and the blind spots in music therapy. And right now in Voices, the online journal for music therapy, World Forum for Music Therapy, they're working on a guest edited special issue on Black aesthetics and the creative arts. And I think this is the first time that there's been a special issue where all of the authors are Black and all of the peer reviewers are Black and all of the guest editors are as well. It's a very important issue. And I think that through voices like Dr. Marisol Norris, who's one of those guest editors, she questions in music therapy, like what needs to die in music therapy, what do we need to become aware of and do away with or completely modify, and a lot of it is that privileging as well. So I think that's something that maybe is easier to see now that I'm kind of out of that context in a way, to sort of see back. Obviously that it's something that I still have to deal with as a white woman in this field. So it's a deeper discussion and situation, obviously, but I think that's something that needs to be addressed and dealt with more constructively.
It sounds like, moving to another country, both when you were younger and then, of course, as an adult to do music therapy has really made a profound impact. And like you said, giving you an opportunity for self-reflection. I definitely think that it's important, whether for music therapists or really anyone, to have the opportunity when it's safe to travel and to visit other cultures and explore and learn, because I think that would really help in creating a better, more cohesive understanding of who we are and how we can help others.
Yeah, and going into such an experience with a good bit of self-awareness of that we don't want to perpetuate patterns either, of assuming that we know what can help other people in other cultures when we're the guests in those cultures. Right.
Yeah, it's sort of like going off to college and you leave home and you meet other people, and then you go home for the holidays and it's like, home's a little different and I'm a little different. Before we go, just a couple more questions. What are some of the best resources for music therapy that you could recommend to someone wanting to go into the field?
I guess it's sort of touting something that I'm involved in, but I think a great resource that's maybe underused is that journal, the Voices World Forum for Music Therapy, because it is online and it's free. So it's accessible to everyone in the world who has an internet connection. And there you can read a variety of types of works about music therapy or topics that inform music therapy, so that you can get to know different ways that therapists work. And especially sort of critical perspectives on how they're approaching their work, with whom, and so forth. So that's a great way, I feel, to get a view of the field in its multiplicity, because it is practiced in very different ways throughout the world. But it also has, that journal has reflective pieces, reflections on practice, cases sometimes, it has essays, it has research papers. So it's a nice way to just get an introduction in a kind of a balanced way from these different perspectives. For those who are already getting into the field, I like the Barcelona Publishers series on guidelines for clinical practice that are quite large volumes, but because they had a template for each chapter, they get very detailed as to what music therapy looks like when you're using different types of approaches within a certain context. I still feel like the chapter that I contributed there on pediatric intensive care is one of the things that I spent quite a long time thinking through, and it was interesting to have that challenge of trying to articulate something specifically when a lot of what we do is sort of in a way an art itself, in that it's very, I think often the way at least I try to practice is responsive to those people that you're working with in the moment, and it really tries to build off of that interaction. So it's interesting to also try to articulate, well, if you use music in all different ways in a certain context, what can it look like, or what can it be like? I think there's also great books now with case studies that also you can buy as ebooks if people don't do paper books anymore, which would be too bad, with case studies, and that's also a great way to get motivated and learn about what music therapy can be.
Excellent. And I'll see if I can find those and put those in the show notes for listeners as well.
Oh, great.
So I'm been curious, what you've explained a lot about, what is meaningful to you and your work and how things are, but what to you does it mean to live a creative life?
I think a creative life is where you are, for most of your time, uncomfortable, because you're pushing yourself to try something new or go into a space that you haven't explored yet, and making yourself vulnerable in that way for something new to occur. And for me, the growing and the creativity stops when you just want to be comfortable, and you just want to have things known, or you just want to have things easy or simple or whatever it is. To me, that sort of feels like, okay, that gets in a box then, and you're not really pushing yourself to expand in that way. I often don't feel like I'm particularly creative, but maybe that's because I have certain assumptions about what creativity is, and maybe it's more flexible in that sort of way. Maybe there's something like a pragmatic creativity that might be more where I'm at. But do you find interest in creative forms of interacting with a problem or a challenge? So it's not necessarily making, in this case, I'm thinking of not necessarily making music or art, but lately I've been getting into bouldering, like climbing. And that to me is very interesting because it's all about creativity. It's just your body and a wall. I've been doing this indoors because it rains here all the time in Bergen. It's kind of hard to do it outside. But then you have to be extremely creative to figure out how do you use these 4 points of contact, or if you're using your knee or something, it's a little bit more than 4, to move up a wall that's can be incredibly challenging. And it's a great way for me to relax and detach from the stress of the everyday work life, because when I'm doing it, I'm totally immersed in that moment and trying to solve this problem and do things creatively. And each time you try a route, you have to be creative. If it's not working, you have to be creative to do something different. So it's like a forced creativity in order to not hurt yourself, or in order to progress a little bit more than you did last time. So if you can call that creative, then that sort of thing is interesting to me, also with trying to understand how music therapy works, of trying to interact with it and think about it and maybe dissect some parts of it, or try out some aspects of hypotheses that you have and see if those are sustained and so forth. I think that's also a kind of creativity that comes into research as well. But it's another manifestation. Yes, I don't know if I'm creative or not. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, that you're choosing to climb a wall. It's almost like a metaphor for things that are happening in life. You're conquering the wall very creatively for fun.
Oh yeah. Exactly. Right. And especially in the pandemic times when you say like, oh, I'm going to be climbing the walls. Like, actually, yes, I have to climb the wall during pandemic so I don't go crazy. It helps in all sorts of ways.
And because I'm just terribly curious and I'm a bit of a foodie, what are some good dishes out there in Norway? Some good food.
Good question. They have very strong food traditions. I imagine where there's certain holidays and you have to make, if you're from a certain part of Norway, you have to make one dish, and if you're from a different part of Norway, make another one. And then it's always like the same menu. So it's cute because that's the question from a lot of Norwegians, like, well, what do you have for Christmas? It's like, well, it varies. I don't know, something warm. And then some dessert. But there's usually very set here. So they have lutefisk as a type of fish, and now it's been a really long time, so I probably don't remember how this, but I think it's actually it used to be stored in lye, very caustic substance. I don't think it is now anymore. That would be dangerous probably, but it was a way to preserve. I mean, Norway was a very poor country for quite a long time. The fish were a resource, and then trying to find ways that you could preserve your fish throughout the times when it wasn't possible to fish them. Same thing with their meats. They have a lot of meats that can be dried, and then they sort of reconstitute them for their meals. So the lutefisk can be quite interesting because it becomes very gelatinous as a fish. And you can either boil it, but if you go too far, then it's kind of like gelatin, which a lot of people don't care for. I've only had it in the oven, which is a little bit more like a braised way to do it, but it's almost like having ceviche with cod is how I would liken it. But so it seems very, very raw, but also very, very soft and sort of a rare way to eat it. When I had it, it was also covered in bacon butter sauce, which if you like bacon, that's a great way to make anything tasty. So I don't know what it would be like without the butter sauce and also boiling it.
Well, that sounds very interesting. I'm not sure if I'd be brave enough to try that, but it does sound interesting. So before we go, a few fun questions, one of which would be if you could have dinner with any creative person or people, dead or alive, who would it be?
I think I would, again, I'm going to play with maybe the common conception of what creative is, but I kind of would say Barack Obama. I think he's creative because he may not think he's creative either. Because I think he's created possibilities for other people and created possibilities for opening the conceptualization of what is possible and what is needed. And I'm curious to know how he might, as we chat over lunch or whatnot, how he keeps a sense of hope, I guess, in a world that can be it can be easy to lose trust in our leaders and the integrity of the people who should be in charge of pushing things forward, like a country and a government. And so it would be helpful for me to sort of hear how he personally keeps his optimism or keeps that motivation to keep facing challenges and prejudices and illogical thinking and other things of like how does one move forward with that and stay fresh and stay motivated and stay hopeful. So I think that could be an interesting lunch conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, that really would. He seems like such a well-rounded guy with such a great positive attitude and hopeful, like you were saying.
Yeah.
One last quirky question is, if we were to rifle through your CD, record collection, music collection, what would be one of the most interesting things we'd find?
Interesting. Probably some of the stuff that my family has created for each other for birthdays. We tend to do music. I guess mostly they're parodies. They're other people's songs that we reinterpret for each other. So maybe some of those would be interesting to someone. I don't know. I sort of have a diverse interest in music, and at least in the realm of classical music in the broadest sense. I like really early music, so chant and Hildegard von Bingen, maybe that a mystic, sort of like a feminist creator of chant, a sacred chant back in the day, to more modern, contemporary, avant-garde music. It's maybe a little bit more challenging to listen to. So yeah, there's a variety, but I guess maybe some of the homemade stuff might be maybe more interesting. I don't know. Surprising.
Definitely sounds like a diverse collection for sure.
That's
excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Claire Ghetti, for joining us on the show. And listeners, you can check out the links in the podcast show notes to learn more about her research, or also to check out some of those resources. And of course, if you like the show, don't forget to share it with your friends. Thanks, and have a great day. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.